Hello! Today I'm going to show you how to make ivy just like this, which you can use in Unreal Engine or Blender. Alright, let's get straight into it. First we need to find a photo of ivy leaves. I took this one with my camera, but you can use any photo that you find online. Don't forget to find or make some reference photos as well. Create an empty Photoshop document and paste in the selected leaves. Arrange the leaves sort of like this. But we have an issue here because we have shadows in our leaves. We also need flat looking leaves. We will need to sort this out. Copy the side of a different leaf and then flip it. Use free transform warp to conform it to the needed shape, and then use levels to control its brightness. Next, erase unneeded parts of the image. Use stamp tool to clean up the texture. Do this with all of your leaves, and 3 or 4 will be more than enough. Duplicate our existing layer and apply Gaussian blur to it. Duplicate the blurred image a bunch of times and then merge these layers. We must now place the layer with blurred texture underneath the layer with base texture. And if you ask why do we have to do this, then the answer is simple: we do not need an ugly border on the edge of our leaves. Apply background color as well. Texturing is now done, so let's start modeling our high poly mesh. Create a plane in Blender, create a new material, and apply our leaf texture. We will now need to cut out our leaves. After this, you will have to model the surface of the leaf. This is going to be pretty straightforward. You just need to understand the basics of sub-D modeling and support loops. Remember that veins of the leaf have to be lower than the rest of the surface. Make sure that you're not making the veins too deep or too wide, because that is going to make leaf look very unnatural. Here is our finished leaf. Now just do the same thing to the rest of them. It is now time to form a cluster from the leaves that we have created. Try to arrange them like in the reference photo. Create the stem that is going to connect them. Apply Solidify modifier to the stem to give it some thickness. Same thing for the leaves, they also have to have the Solidify modifier applied to them. Okay, our single cluster is done. Now duplicate it, rotate it, and change position, rotation, and scale of the leaves. This is going to be our second cluster. I went ahead and created the final cluster, and now I'm looking at the reference photo to understand what kind of shapes I need to make with the clusters that I have. So basically, with the clusters that we have created, we can make any kind of shape, and this is the beginning of our first module. Right now I'm just duplicating and rotating and scaling them. Try to arrange them in such a way that they have different rotations. This way they're going to catch light in a pleasant way. Geometrical planes behind the modules of Ivy are our bake planes. Here I'm already UV mapping them. You can see that my low poly planes are not exactly straight, which is not correct, and I will fix it later on in the video. It is also going to be useful to simply bake our clusters to a plane. We will use them to add more detail to the modules. Now you can see me putting the low poly planes in the correct orientation. They have to be 90 degrees. I am baking my ivy in Marmoset tool bag, and I constantly go back and forth between Blender and Marmoset because I want to see how the silhouette is going to be, how my normal map is going to react to light, and you need many iterations to get this right. I think this was the most time-consuming process to arrange these clusters into modules on the texture. So this is only the first iteration of the ivy leaves, but you will notice that they are now kinda floating in space. They are not connected to each other with branches, and this is what we are going to do next. Real quick, I am creating a new module, which is going to be our tall module here. And we will test branch placement on this one. But before we do, you will see that I'm not only changing the rotation and placement of clusters, but I'm also changing rotation of individual leaves and also scaling them. This is done to accommodate its shape and also make it look more natural. For the branches, we will use Bezier curve, increase bevel depth to give it thickness, and connect our clusters with curves. Give it some irregularity and don't make it too uniform. Remember that branch placement has to make some sense. Create branch material for our splines and make it brownish. With this material applied to high poly, we can bake it down to low poly texture. Let's do our test bake. Apply the color for the branches in Marmoset as well. Here's our test bake, looking good already. And since this is a fitting thickness to the spline branches, we can go ahead and add spline branches to the rest of the modules. Okay, looking good, but what we are missing is a single branch with a little bit of leaves on it. We are also going to make it with spline tool, but we will make it a little bit thicker. Place some leaves clusters onto it. Maybe make it a little longer than that. Once again, optimally arrange UV mapping. I am baking this down to a 2K texture. Let's bake this texture for the final time. In Marmoset toolbag, in the high poly material, you will need to put diffusion to unlit. And if your albedo is too dark when you bake it, then disable sRGB under albedo settings. Disable reflectivity as well. Enable albedo to bake color. When you're baking normal maps or albedo, set padding to moderate. This way you will avoid seams at the edges. I am setting padding of Material ID map to none. I also recommend baking Material ID map. If you have divided your mesh into several materials, like one for branches, one for leaves, this is going to divide them into colors, different colors like blue and red and green. And you can also use this map as opacity. I use this map for masking when texturing. So here you see me changing the saturation of the image and then adjusting levels so that I basically get opacity map out of the Material ID. Here's my final texture. You can see that I have added some color variation to some of the leaves, and also I added some ambient occlusion to the base color texture from AO map that I have baked. Now with this texture we can assemble our low poly modules. We'll need to model our low poly cluster here and give it a single loop inside it to give it the 3D look. Cut out individual leaves and rotate them. This mesh is going to be placed on every module. Do the same for our branches. Cut out and rotate some of its elements. But this time we will also copy a part of our branch. Deform the branch and then put leaf clusters onto it. This branch is now done. Basically what you need to understand what I'm doing here is I'm cutting out some of the elements, rotating them and adding leaf cluster so that from every angle from which you look at the module, it's not looking flat but three-dimensional. Don't forget that at some points you will have to deform existing elements and not only rely on already existing elements that you have created, like leaf clusters that we have made before. Next up, we are going to create roots or just branches without leaves. Depends on how you want to call it. Once again, we are going to use our trusty Bezier curves for this. Once you have created a nice base for it, we can then proceed with sculpting. I will export our Bezier curves from Blender to ZBrush, but you can also sculpt it in Blender. The only thing that I want to achieve here in ZBrush is the knots on our branches, and that's it. So also achievable in Blender sculpting if you are experienced with that. Inside ZBrush I have also created some reusable elements that I can use throughout my sculpt to give it more detail. We will bake this onto a different texture, but if you want to save texture memory, you can also put the branches onto the same texture as your leaves. And here's how they look when baked. With all of these modules created, you can now start set dressing your scene. Hopefully with this knowledge you can now create something awesome. Alright, thank you, and see you next time.